Welcome back to Cheap Pop, everybody. It has been a little bit. We've been out of pocket for a little bit, but we're coming back now with a hopefully slew of episodes here. We're going to be covering something that we've talked about for a while in Neon Genesis Evangelion. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at the series itself, the original 26 episode series plus the end of Evangelion. Feature movie there. That was, I think it's only about 80 minutes, maybe an hour and a half, but very, very influential anime series, and to this day is still widely discussed. So, back in the fold here, I'm joined once again by my friend Matt, and Matt, you're new to Evangelion, right?
I am. Never seen it before. Well, before last night, that is.
Yeah, it's very. I've seen it several times at this point. I think it was probably about a year, not a year. It's probably been a couple of years since I first brought it up to you. My first experience with it was probably about 3 years ago, and I watched the series, and I remember being just mystified by it. It definitely changes midway. Not getting into any of that stuff now, because obviously today we're only going to be talking about the first couple episodes. We're going to be doing this in kind of coupled episodes, 2 to 3 episodes at a time, probably. But it's definitely one of those things that I remember I was really fascinated by and into, looked into the lore a whole lot to try and make theories and understand it a little better. And then I came back to it just within the last year and finally watched the Rebuild movies, which spanned from like 2007 to just last year. And it's the whole thing. I love the franchise, so I'm excited that we're finally both in the fold here, and we're going to get to talk about these. But we'll start off with this first episode here. So what's your first kind of impression with this? I watched it earlier this week, but I know I want to get your fresh thoughts because you're the really interesting perspective here.
Well, initially I was a little afraid, just because digging into any anime, you can run into one that you don't quite like as much as everybody else. But I would say pretty much immediately, I was digging it. Like it starts off great. Also, I'm watching the English dub version, which is fantastic, which is also a terrifying thing stepping into anime, because that can pretty much ruin it, or you'll be reading and missing some of the action along the way. So I would say I'm definitely digging it. Major Pacific Rim vibes, which I'm sure is entirely influenced by this show after watching a couple episodes. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited to see where it goes, for sure.
Yeah, it opens up, and the first episode just has great energy behind it. You know, you basically are thrown right into the deep end. They tell you it's the first angel attack in 15 years. So you have this protagonist here, 14-year-old Shinji Ikari. He's being summoned basically to this nerve headquarters, which is like an underground Tokyo 3 city, where it's like, this is like the defense for humanity. It's been 15 years since the last angel attack, and now on the day he's meant to report there at his father's orders, who he hasn't seen in like 8 years, the angel attacks. And so you're immediately thrown into this where just trying to get to Nerve, he's almost having to run for his life just to get there. And then as soon as he gets there, it's like, hey, by the way, we didn't really get a chance to tell you what we wanted to bring you in for. We want you to pilot one of these things, and you kind of have to do it right now. You don't have time for training. Like we kind of just have to throw you into the deep end right now because the other pilot is basically dying.
Yeah, this poor kid got no warning whatsoever. It's just like your whole world is going to get torn apart. You're going to meet your dad again, who you haven't seen for an undisclosed amount of time. But we know it's 3 years, maybe, I think, was what they were saying. Maybe 8.
I think 8 is how long it's been since he's seen
considerable amount of time. And it seems like he just kind of got left. And then it's, hey, jump on in here. We need you to fight literally the worst thing on planet Earth right now, with no prior experience. And good luck. Bye.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he literally, like, when he's thrown into the Ava, which is these basically a giant almost mech suit, but it's not just a robot. They tell you it's like an artificial human, essentially, that they've created. And these are these basically giant machines, cyborgs, if you will, that they use to kind of fight against the angels. And as his elevator, whatever, takes his Ava Unit 1 up there, they're like, okay, now imagine walking. They're like telling him the most basic instruction of just how to move the damn thing. And it's just like, oh, this is not a good, this is not good if you're having to explain these kind of basics to him as he's supposed to be defending the entire city. And presumably, as they tell you, all of humanity in this case. It's not like he's just protecting Tokyo 3. He's having to protect everything with it. So high stakes right out of the gate. And I especially love with this series how right out of the gate you feel like you're getting a real sense of multiple characters here, like you're kind of getting an idea of their individual, how they tick a little bit, like whether it's their individual hangups or anything like that. And for one episode to be that fast paced and have that kind of urgency behind it while giving you insight into 4 or 5 characters is really impressive for like a 22-minute runtime for the first episode. So was there any particular character that stood out to you? Obviously Shinji, the protagonist, but whether him or someone else, did something stand out to you that seemed particularly interesting?
I mean, the main girl, obviously, she starts off and has like such high energy and is so interesting. And you're just like, I want a backstory on this person immediately, which I think they did a pretty good job of that in the show. Is like everybody they showed you was very different, even though you had such limited screen time with each of them. It's like you could immediately tell that they all had very different backstories that you want to kind of like dive deeper into, which I think is also a struggle with a lot of animes, is like everybody can seem like a generic character, and then you have to kind of wait for it to build up so you can learn more about them. But this one, immediately right off the bat, you were questioning what everybody's background is.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the main girl you referenced is Misato Katsuragi. She's kind of like, she doesn't oversee Nerve entirely, but she's the one who essentially, like, when the Avas are having these fights with the Angels, she's kind of the commander overseeing that, but she still has to report through her channels and everything and get approval for certain things. Shinji's father is who's basically overseeing this defense force called Nerve, or depending on the dub you hear. That's one of the things with the dubs. There's not like a definitive English version. Like the one you're watching, Netflix version, is actually the newest dub that's been made. Netflix has its own version of the dub. And I like the voice actors they got. Like you said, they do a great job. There's some stuff in that with some of the translation that can be a little wonky at times. And, in certain scenes, it could even change like the tone of a thing, which for a series like this in particular can be a kind of big deal. But it's still well done. And it's just one of those, I had a thread of a point and it started to just flitter away on me.
Well, in speaking about that, so the second I started listening to the dialogue, that was my immediate thought. I was like, there is no way in hell that this is the 1995 dubbing of this show. This has definitely been redone, because you will hear so many dubs that are just like unbearable to watch, which this one is really enjoyable. But another fear is like, where am I missing out on the dialogue? But also when I'm doing subs, which I don't have a problem with, I do miss a little bit of the movie sometimes, which I don't like to, especially if it's like high paced, fast action, that kind of thing.
This dub was made in 2019 when Netflix released it, and getting streaming rights to Ava was actually kind of a nightmare. It was tied up with for like not just broadcast rights, but like streaming rights, all that, like with so many different companies and everything. It was just a huge headache. And so you've had all these different versions that have been released. The version that I have, so I actually have this series on Blu-ray, and it includes the End of Evangelion movie with it. And I think that version is still the Netflix dub that you have as well. But even then, as many times as it's gone through, you'll still have weird things. You might have noticed it at one point when they're referring to Shinji, and I think it's the first episode, they refer to him as the third children. That is such a mind-boggling, just simple grammatical thing that I don't understand how, like, an early English dub for some reason put children instead of child, the third child. But for whatever reason, when Netflix went through, they left the mistake in there. And I'm just like, why? That it's just little things like that. But there's definitely tonal things as well, where even if they're giving the same line, you could still have it be where the direction to the voice actor can make a difference. I've seen episodes or scenes specifically where the dialogue between the Japanese and English dub is exact, but you hear the way it's delivered in the English version, you get one impression, and then you hear the Japanese version, and you're like, okay, there seems to be more like undertone or subtext to that,
Hmm.
and so there is stuff like that. Ava's very much an open into interpretation at times series, especially on these kind of underlying character moments. But it's very very cool stuff. I've always really appreciated the character work in this series because you get, like I said, right off the bat, this idea of all these characters, what their hangups are, what their personalities are like. We know immediately Shinji has severe abandonment issues, self confidence issues, and all of that. You hear him constantly telling himself, "Don't run away, don't run away." Like he's trying to just to like psych himself up, just to like hang in there and endure it, because this is the only time anyone's ever shown any inkling of really caring for him. You know, they finally send for him. He's there, and he's like, "If I run away, I'll be alone again," and that's not what he wants. So he's like trying to stick this out. He also sees Ray just in a horrible state. She's badly injured from a previous thing. And so he's like, "Oh, if I don't go, they're going to make her go and she's going to die. She might even die even without going in her current condition. So I have to do something. I can't just do nothing." And you see like Misato, she mentions as well having issues with her father as well, like when they're driving to the nerve center.
Hmm.
Gendo, man, he could not care less about Shinji, that Gendo Akari. Um, whether it's the first time seeing him or whatever, he's basically just like, shut up and get in the robot. That's basically like his entire thing. And there's a moment where the angel is actually breaking through because the nerve operations center is below ground, the geofront they'll call it, and it's actually smashing through the floor, getting to the command center, and this is causing everything to shake, stuff to break and fall. And Ava Unit 1 actually, like, without a pilot, actually activates and like shields Shinji, like raises an arm up to shield Shinji from falling debris. And it cuts to Gendo, and you're like, huh, no concern over his son nearly dying. Also, he kind of seems like he like expected that. Like he's not the least bit um like, oh, what just happened? Like he's just kind of like, it's almost like confirmation to him of something.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting sort of thing that he's like, hey, you come here. I'm gonna call you out of nowhere into this. I haven't talked to you or seen you in 8 years. This is now immediately happening. You're going to now pilot this thing, and I'm not going to even express concern over your well-being. So there's all kinds of immediate, interesting kind of driving questions with that. And I like the cliffhanger that the first episode ends with too, of like basically right as he's getting to the surface level and basically is like, I don't know how to pilot this. I don't know what to do. And the angel's kind of going on the attack against him. That's a really good cliffhanger point that, like you said, you finished watching episode 1 and you were like, I can't just watch one. Like that's the mark of a really effective pilot, I think.
Well, when the mech is protecting the boy,
Hmm.
the thing that I noticed, which they kind of mentioned on a little bit after, is they're like, "Oh, it protected him." Which, if you look at that scene, and I think this is what you're figuring out in episode 2 a little bit more without diving into that, is that it's mimicking him. I mean, it's doing the exact same motion that he's doing over his
Hmm.
head with the robot, not the robot, the mech. I
Yeah.
got to stop saying robot. Um,
Just say Ava.
Ava.
Yeah.
So that's really when you like kind of first see there's some sort of a connection between Ava and the boy.
Hmm.
Um, and real quick to go back onto the dubbing, the one thing I did notice, I didn't notice the children thing, but I did notice that everyone says nerve incredibly strangely. It's
Yeah,
like
they say like nerve or something.
nerve, nerve.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a weird dub thing where it's like because the acronym doesn't have an E on the end of the word, they're like saying it weird, like they're trying to
Hmm.
emphasize it. I don't know why that is. You'll hear that in other cases too. Like there's another organization kind of behind Nerve, and that's not a spoiler, called like it's basically SEALE, and you'll hear it at times referred to as like Zele, Sele, like it's just like you'll hear like a couple different versions, and it's like, did you guys ever really settle on one, or are you just like, it's close enough, they'll know what we mean?
Take a guess.
Yeah, yeah, it's a little wild at times, but for the most part, the dub is good. The performances are good. There's just a couple times where I think the voice direction, because I've watched the subtitle version and the dub version, especially for the end of Evangelion movie, and there's other weird things too, where different English dubs over the years, like for some reason, like modified like the sound design in certain scenes, and you're like, when you watch the end of Evangelion movie, you'll be like, why did those monsters think this needed any work? The sound design of that movie is basically perfect.
Hmm.
And the stuff like once you know like the adjustments they made to it, you're like, why? That undercuts the tone. Like, what are you doing? It's it's a really impressive work in it. I like that Ava isn't just like kind of a subversion of the mech anime genre itself, but it really dives into like the characters. It's almost like psychoanalytical, um, and looking at the characters and really fleshing them out, um, and exploring kind of their individual, whether it's their traumas or just kind of what makes them tick. Like there's different episodes that spotlight different characters, and you really get a sense of how that affects their interactions throughout that. Like I know there's a lot of different shows or even other animes that'll kind of dabble with that sort of thing as well. But I feel like Ava really thrives in doing it, where like once you kind of understand this particular part of a character's backstory, you're like, oh, that makes sense for all of this now. And now even going forward, like that feels relevant.
Hmm.
Other times it's just other shows they'll do it and you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then it kind of goes back to not being as much of a factor.
Yeah.
I think Ava does a great job of balancing that, where everything feels like it's giving you better insight and clarity to the characters, and why they at times struggle with each other, why at times they're closer than they are. It's just really, really good stuff. Um, so that's the gist of episode one. We kind of ran through. I know we've been talking a little bit all around Ava in general at this point. Episode two takes a different approach a little bit. So I said we left off at a great cliffhanger, and we see about maybe a minute of that fight to start the episode, and then we flash cut to Shinji waking up in a hospital bed. And I think
After getting absolutely pummeled
oh yeah,
by that
like
creature.
yeah, his arm
Full on, like
broken.
basically a gunshot to the head, blood
Yep.
spewing, just no hope in sight.
Yeah. Basically a lobotomy, right? Like it's like through the eye, stabs through the back of through the Ava and everything. And again, you mentioned like Pacific Rim, when they're connected with these Avas, they're in like this. No, he wasn't in the first episode, but they wear basically like these plug suits, and they're in these kind of tubes that are inserted into like this basically spinal cord of the Avas, and it's like it's linking up their senses. Same idea as the drift in Pacific Rift Rim, that it's like syncing up their senses and everything with the Ava. So when the Ava's in pain, they're they're not actually being physically harmed, but it feels to them like they are. So
Yeah.
like his arm immediately grabbed and broken, um, as he's getting basically the Ava's getting impaled through the head. He's feeling some measure of that sensation, and so that's why they're talking about like, yeah, he hasn't been trained at all for this, but just that kind of damage in general, that's like severe damage to like your cranial nerves and
Hmm.
everything. Like this is not a thing for maybe a 14-year-old to be doing. But I really liked how the episode gives you like a little bit of that taste where you see just kind of the urgency and the dire nature of the fight, how everything is like, oh God, what's about to happen? And then it completely changes gears, suddenly brings it down, and you're jumping back into it. It's like the next day, he wakes up in the hospital. He's not physically hurt, but he kind of has almost like that same sort of thing as like the phantom limb sort of thing, like that
Hmm.
fresh memory of the pain. He's like looking at his arm and he's like remembering how it felt broken, but now he's looking at it and it's fine. And it's just it doesn't connect. Um, and he doesn't have memory of what happened. And they're saying like, well, given the head injury he suffered in the suit that was simulated, then that might make sense. It could be nothing, but physically he seems fine.
Hmm.
And immediately you get an indication that like, oh yeah, so he's here now. He's in Tokyo 3, but he's not going to live with his dad because his dad he's like, the Akari men don't really interact. We're better apart. And so they're just going to stick him in like his own like random apartment or something somewhere. And Misato actually looks at that and was like, no, that's ridiculous. He's 14. He doesn't need to be on his own. He'll just come live with me. Um, and so Shinji's going to go live with her at that point. You get a little bit of comedic relief and everything. For whatever reason, she has a pet like penguin. And so you get the little bit of levity with that, where he sees the penguin, freaks out, not knowing what it is, runs out of the bathroom after he was about to like get in the bath, and he's naked. Um, doesn't even realize he's just standing like full schlong out in front of her or whatever, covered by a Coke can and then a smaller Coke can. I thought that was a nice little, nice little secondary joke there. But yeah, it's just you still kind of get that sense even in her dialogue there. She basically like has a conversation with him like, "What? Oh no, he's a penguin. He's basically my other roommate." Yeah, and then eventually she's like, "So are you gonna like hide that? Like, are you gonna like put that away?" Then he realizes like, "Oh crap, I'm naked." He blushes, scoots away, and you even get a little bit of insight to her there as she kind of says like, "I can't lay it. I got to be careful laying it on so thick, or he'll see through it." And basically it's just showing like as characters kind of present the front that they have, it's not always like their authentic feeling or thought towards something. So like everybody kind of has like the actual self versus what they allow others to see. So especially her not knowing him but trying to be like cheerful and welcoming and all of that, that's kind of like what she's projecting to him, but she doesn't want him to see through it being kind of like a false front, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm
um
interested in what her motivation is too. Which, I mean, what we're getting from her is the first thing you need to know. Since episode one, this is the hot girl. She
yeah,
wears tight clothes. You get to see some butt shots. Like they want you to
yeah.
know she's a hottie. So
Hmm.
don't forget it. And then also we established that she is messy and a complete alcoholic
Yeah.
because within like moments of us seeing this dinner table, she's got 42 beers stacked up into
Yep.
this giant pile, questioning like, what is this girl doing here? Like, what does she eat? Does she only drink alcohol? And she seems fine, but like, is this
Yeah.
part of the ruse? Why are we trying to represent this?
Yeah. Shinji, when he's trying to put the groceries away, he's like looking through the cabinets and the fridges, and he's like, ice, snacks, beer. And he's like, is that all she has? Like she can't cook for anything. She makes a reference to like the food that she serves all being microwave stuff. Yeah, she basically is just kind of a slob. But she definitely is someone who, I guess you could say like her sexuality kind of like, I think that's part of the sort of front, I guess, of her, if you will, like the sort of self she presents forward, not just because of like actual backstory things like that, where it's like, oh, okay, well maybe that would make someone more this way versus whatever. I think it's also just I think it's also just kind of like a thing of her character and like trying to sort of nudge Shinji into whatever way of like just relaxing and unwinding that she can in that case. So if she's warm and cheerful, if she's, it's like that, he doesn't respond to that. He stays very like tight lipped, just like, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Like he's just very quiet and reserved. And so I think she's trying to kind of coax him out of that shell a little bit. And so even then, with how she's like interacting at times, sometimes her jokes or whatever are a little more inappropriate. It's like she's trying to kind of like get some sort of reaction where he sort of relaxes and settles. and doesn't just be so buttoned up the whole time.
Yeah, she even makes a joke to her friend, like,
I'm not
you
going to
know,
try anything.
I'm not going to try anything, which I kind of get a small sense that, maybe she would. Maybe this is
Yeah.
even though she might not know it, seems a little groomy. We'll see where
Yeah.
that goes, though.
Yeah. And even the friend is like, of course you're not. Why would you even say that? You're so messed up. Like,
And she's like, oh, yeah, ha ha ha, just kidding. Ha, ha.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting sort of, I guess, dynamic where you don't really know that. But anyway, so as that episode is kind of unwinding, she first tells Shinji like, "Oh, the bath's a great way to clear your head out." And Shinji's he still doesn't really remember what happened in the fight, but you do see in like a sort of B-roll scene, if you will, them collecting like at least part of the head of Unit 1. And so you're like, "Ooh, so that went like even though we haven't seen yet exactly what happened, that went really badly. Like how did he survive that?"
Mhm.
And then you kind of see it going through this progression where it's like he's starting to kind of piece it together as he's like sitting in the bath. He's talking about how he can't clear his head out. It's like he only thinks about the bad stuff when he's kind of in that sort of quiet, almost meditative state. And he kind of gets some of the memory back. And then when he's like trying to go to bed for the first night in his room at her apartment, that's the first time that you actually see how the fight turned out. And so his Ava, after it basically gets lobotomized, just wigs out. They say it essentially goes like it fully disconnects. So he is not mentally connected to it anymore. The drift, if you will, using a Pacific Rim term, has dissolved at this point. He's not connected to the Ava, and yet the Ava wakes up. And they're saying like, as it like opens its mouth, kind of unhinges its mouth and yells. They even make a comment of like it's going berserk. So like this is again giving kind of credence to these Avas aren't just robots. Like there's something about them that even though they don't fully understand it, I don't know if they call them artificial humans. So it's like almost like, do you say it's almost like a humanity to the thing? I don't know, but there's something almost like a primal sort of savage nature to these things. Basically, the Ava just goes ape shit. Somehow heals its broken arm. It's thrown itself at the angel, and it just tears it apart. Eventually, rips off like one of its exposed ribs and like stabs it through that. Basically, the heart of the angel, which is that kind of red orb on its chest. With the angels, like when you destroy those, like it's like its core essentially, then the whole thing dies. And so Unit 1 wigs out, goes berserk, tears the thing apart, and as the thing is about to die, it actually latches on to Unit 1 and self-destructs. And yet Unit 1 walks away, seemingly, they think, unscathed, but then the front half of the face mask, whatever, falls off. So it was, I guess that's a better way of saying it. It's not that it was its head that fell off or part of its head. It's that like the
The
Avas
mask.
themselves have like almost armor to them. But like that's the whole point, is like there is something underneath. And what traumatized Shinji wasn't just the cranial damage, all that. He actually catches a glimpse, sort of like he basically looks straight into the Ava's eye. Like there's a reflection in the windows of an office building. The mask falls off, and he kind of sees something. He looks over, and the eye heals itself, and he like locks eyes with it, and it like just traumatizes him, triggers something in him. Because normally its eyes are just like glowing through the eye holes of the mask. You don't really see the eye as well. So there's something there that like deeply disturbed him, and that's what caused his memory loss and everything. And now it's like, oh, okay, well, he remembers this now. So you're interested, like, where's this going to go? What's the fallout going to be from this? Like it's
See, and I was trying to figure out in that moment, it's like, is he actually seeing that, or is he dreaming that he saw that? Like, what level did this actually happen? Like, is he imagining that this creature is more alive than it actually is, or is that a real memory that he, somewhat suppressed and is getting back now?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a real memory. That is actually that. But yes, they do, the way they present it, like you said, it is something that you're not completely sure of immediately, because yeah, like you said, he's laying in bed as he's doing that one, where some of the other memories were in the bath, where you're like, oh well, we know he's awake there. So yeah,
And from
it's
my perspective, where we're at right now, as far as like when that fight happened and
mhm.
the when Ava went, berserk mode and started attacking, is and I haven't seen further, so I don't know where this is going to go. But from my thought is this is his body has either maybe he's unconscious, maybe something like that, and then it's like kind of like a protection, like your brain is protecting your body even though you
Mm-hmm.
can't. So it's like he is fully taken over and integrated into this thing, even though on paper it doesn't look like it has. Just like before when he's not connected, and he covers him from the falling building pieces that are
Yeah.
coming. It's like it's more instinct at that point than like a functional unit that you're helping with. You're not
Mm-hmm.
controlling it anymore. It's just almost automatic. Your brain
Instinctive.
is connected with it. Yeah,
Like a reflex.
kind of like kind of like Neo in the Matrix. Like when he goes unconscious and then he's in the Matrix again. It's like, okay, it shifted you to this place that you didn't even know you could reach, but now you have. I mean, you're fully controlled. You can do anything you want in this world, but you're not really connected in the traditional sense.
Yeah. It's very interesting, and I like how even though the energy of like how the episode ends, like I said, the first episode ends with like that like in mid battle cliffhanger where you're like, oh, what's going to happen? Then episode 2 also really kind of leads you wanting to come back and like know what's going to happen in the next episode, but like it's doing it from a very tonally different place. He's just laying in his bed and just remembering something, and you're like, oh shit, where's that going to go? Where's that going to lead? Like it's at a very different place it's operating from, and yet it's still very interesting and engaging, which I like. So it's good. There's 26 episodes in total. If we're doing these pairs of 2s, 3s, however we want to do it, then we'll move through it pretty quick. I'm excited for you to watch this for sure, because it's one of those things that like as the series goes on, you're gonna be more like, what the fuck? Like what I gotta know. Like you're just gonna kind of keep going further into it. Like it's really cool. And then, we'll see after we watch the end of Evangelion. Like I said, there's 4 movies that came out after this sort of rebuild series. That would be awesome as well. The last one of those came out, the US release of it at least was just last year. I actually in December saw that in theaters, and that was a treat, seeing Evangelion, its final installment, if you will, in theaters was very, very surreal.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, and I obviously don't want to get too into this because I want to follow it on my own pace, but you mentioned there being kind of a shift, or maybe a shift in tone halfway through the season. How extreme are we talking here? Is this like Death Note shift where it's like, wow, this is a very different story, like almost like we've ended one and started another?
It's like a little bit of the focus shifts. Like you still have what's going on and everything. What's interesting about Ava, it came out in 95, like we talked about, and the creator, Hideki Anno, was, as he was making it, going through a severe depression, and he basically took like a real interest in like that sort of psychoanalysis and everything. And so I think that's actually what helps impart the depth of character to this, was him trying to understand his own depression and like these things and triggers and influences for himself. And so you see these traits show up in different characters, but as the series goes on, the character work deepens. And so like you still have the angels and you still have all these things going on, but you have a little bit more focus to the characters, which by that point you're fully invested in. It's just by the end of it, you'll know exactly what I mean. And end of Evangelion is I think a perfect bookmark or bookend to the original series, for sure. But it's definitely one of those things you can tell, like as he's working through it, it's almost like seeing him not work through his depression in real time, but just that self analysis. And then you kind of see like episode to episode, almost as he's, again, not working through it, but just coming to understand it. Some of the focus shifts more towards that sort of element of it. But it's it's good. And again, the whole idea is that it's going sort of against the grain on what a typical mech anime would be. It's not going like the traditional thing where everything is just the fights and all of that. Those are there, but they're almost like they start to become the secondary story somewhat, if that makes sense. You just have to see it. I'm not. I feel like I'm not explaining it well, but I'm not trying to make it sound like, oh, you've already seen cool stuff. Don't worry, it gets less cool. No. It's it's fascinating. I think for me, it's the reason Ava is my favorite anime and something I can revisit time and time again. Is because of the character work and everything like that. Every character feels so fleshed out. Even characters you don't like, you at least understand why they are the way they are, at least for the most part. And you're like, that if nothing else, you're memorable because I understand, like, given these experiences, why you would behave in certain ways. It's not just like, oh, well, this thing happened to this person 10 years ago, and so they don't like this type of person now. It's not as like black and white as that. It's not as like surface level as that. Like there's deeper undertone and subtext to how they even just behave in their day-to-day life, how they interact with anybody. And I think that really shines through well.
So with this 26 episode series, and then we're finishing it off with some movies, is there a reason that it didn't extend the series and went the movie route, kind of seemingly like a Firefly type situation? Or is this just, had some additional content after the fact and didn't have enough to like really recreate a secondary part to the series?
Yeah. So the original 26 episode run was going to be it. And there were all kinds of theories and stuff about the very end of the series. Japan was in a recession at the time, a bad recession, and so there were all kinds of theories and like towards the end of the series and how it wrapped up the 26 episode run. And Ano always maintained that theory wasn't the case, that it wasn't budgetary stuff at all, that it was something he experimentally wanted to do with his initial ending. And they caught massive for that, like backlash and everything. Like the series was such a huge success, even in its initial run, that with the way they took the original thing, it's something that it didn't fit the expectation fans had. And so it was almost like they basically pressed him to essentially make the end of Evangelion, which came out in 97. And it fills in gaps. It's like it's giving you what you might have expected and wanted. It's not retconning anything. That's a big disclaimer, or not disclaimer, clarification there. It's not like it's retconning the end of the series, but that's why I said it's like a good bookend to the original series. Whereas when the rebuild movies came out starting in 2007, those are different. They're not remakes. They're not retcons. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without giving too much away. I don't think it's giving too much away. The way that Hideki Anno explained it is it's essentially like time, like cycles of time. So it's kind of like you have everything that plays out in the series, and then you have things kind of repeating down the road. So like the rebuild series follows a lot of the large structure, but there are differences. It's not the same thing told the same way. There whether it's different characters, whether it's certain things that you're like, oh, I kind of remember this sort of thing from the series. It's not going to follow the exact thing. It's going to go a different direction. It's like, oh, okay, now let's see the ripple effect of how this thing going differently now affects things going forward. It's really interesting. But if you look at the parallel to Anno's real life, a lot of people say that Ava is part of what makes it so raw and just impactful is because like you really do get a glimpse into Anno's mind specifically. He says in all of his characters there's a piece of him, particularly in Shinji and one other character who comes into play later. Those two in particular are basically the two sides of him, and the original series and end of Evangelion was kind of like going through the depths of his depression, whereas the Rebuild series still goes through those same waters, but in real life, that's kind of when he was coming out the other side of it finally.
Hmm.
That's around the time he met his now wife and kind of started to get more healthy, get better mental health and all that. And so it's kind of like revisiting, because you got to think about it. Like if Ava is almost like the face of your depression, but it's also your legacy, that's got to be kind of a conflicting relationship you have with it, right? Like it is what you're known for, it is your legacy, but it's also the embodiment of all of your pain and everything that you've suffered through in your life. And so revisiting it and Rebuild is kind of him working through that and actually processing it finally.
It's like I think Under the Bridge by the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen them a couple of times in concert. Never hear him play that song because it's about when he was struggling with heroin, and Under the Bridge is him doing heroin under this bridge. So it's like it's an incredibly popular song that everybody loves, but it's like also forcing you to relive this horrible time in your life.
Yep.
So it's like, where do you draw the line? Is like, how much do I want to take from that, and how much do I want to just leave where it was?
Yeah, no, exactly. So yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting watch. Like I said, that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in doing the podcast now this way, is just because I've seen it several times. I still, every time I watch it, will take away something new. Like there's another friend of mine that I've had watched the series over the last year, and I've been talking with her about it every now and then. And at some point, after she got about 3/4 of the way through the series watch again, I jumped in, got caught up to where she was, then went through, for me, the first time going through the Rebuild series. And the reason I did that was because I was like, oh shit, the final installment is coming out in theaters in December. I got to get through this now, because now all of a sudden there's, the end is in sight. It's one of those things like that. Like once you see it's wrapping up, you're like, yep, okay, I want to see this through. But it's since then I've gone through it several times. My perspective, even then, I can always watch it and take away something different, whether it's a nuance, whether it's a little detail that just kind of got glossed over, where I'm like, okay, that's a really good way that they showed that little character moment, just this subtle little something that kind of gives you some insight there, versus you totally new to the experience, and therefore, you don't have any, other than probably the too much I've already given away just talking now about it. You don't have those sort of preconceptions and everything like that. Like it's totally fresh to you. And so I feel like that's a sort of interesting dynamic we can kind of bring to the discussion.
Yeah. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where this goes.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I think that'll wrap up the first couple episodes of Evangelion, Neon Genesis Evangelion. Like I said, we'll try and do 2-3 episodes a week on this. We'll talk about it, and as we work through it, we'll try to stay more in the present of what's actually happening in episode to episode. Obviously, being the first 2 episodes, it's hard to dig too deep into it. But I'll try in future ones to not start talking about like anything like, you'll see as it goes on, without really getting too close to all that. But I'm looking forward to it. I think this is going to be a fun sort of project. I think it's a good kind of mini series to reboot the Cheap Pop podcast and everything. But yeah, is there any other thoughts you had on just the first 2 episodes of it, the initial impression?
No, I don't think anything at this point. I definitely like it, and I'm glad that I liked it so quickly, because I was afraid it was going to take a little bit longer to really to get on board. But I think it pretty much immediately draws you in, which is an impressive feat, especially for something that's, gosh, how old are we now? 20. That's 28 years ago that this came out. So
yeah,
we're talking quite a bit of time, and it still feels relatively fresh.
Oh yeah, and it's hugely popular even now. Like I know, as I said, obviously the Rebuild movie's just finished up, but it's not just that it was influential in the future of like anime and even Hollywood production stuff like Pacific Rim and all that, but it is a major franchise in Japan even now. It's like Hideki Anno, you might remember, also directed 2016 Shin Godzilla, so you've seen some of his work before.
Yes.
And if you went back and watched it, there are 3 or 4 Evangelion scores that are in Shin Godzilla, including stuff you would have heard in the first episode. So if you were to go back and watch that now, you'd be like, oh shit, I know this. Like, it's kind of cool seeing
Oh,
his
that's
take
great.
on
I
it.
did feel like there was some. I was like, man, I feel like I've heard this before. So that's funny. I'm gonna have to go back and watch that and
Yep.
pick those apart a little bit.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I actually I got hassled yesterday because my girlfriend was asking me what show we were watching. And when I told her, she's like, "Yeah, that's the best. You should know about this. This is if you like anime, you should definitely know this."
Nice.
Okay, she's more of an anime nerd than me, so
Okay. Cool.
I think she's gonna probably stick it out with me. Hopefully.
Perfect. Sounds like a plan. All right. Well, we'll be back next week. I guess we'll try and release these weekly, Monday or Tuesday mornings. We'll fall into a schedule, I'm sure, one way or the other. But we'll be back next week with at least 2 more episodes, maybe 3. We'll try to fall into a system here. But until next time, guys, just stay tuned, and we'll be back to talk more Evangelion.